happen. So I'm now recording. Good morning, everyone. This is our late March meeting of the Energy Storage Working Group. We circulated drafts and several sets of comments were received. And I think the most significant area of comments is emissions. So that's where we're going to start. Hopefully everyone has copies of the spreadsheet that were circulated. Staff made comments and PHI and BGE comments were also submitted in a spreadsheet. So we're roughly at lines, it starts with 64, item number 64, and proceeds from there. Is everyone with me? Can I have some? I just want to make sure.
We're here, Judge.
Okay. I want to make sure I wasn't just speaking into the ether.
Yeah.
Okay. So if I could explain a little bit the item number 64, emissions reductions, the first line, any emissions reductions expected as a result of the project, and that statutory reference, so that language comes out of 216H7I47, and that's the sort of the general or umbrella, right? And then 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, attempt to break that down as we had in the original filing. And then in 65, what I attempted to do, which apparently Steve, you didn't like, is he on yet? As I understand it, there are two different types of measurements we can do with respect to carbon. And I'm not talking just about going from the tons to the dollars, but two different ways of measuring what's happening. One is the decrease or increase when you shift from peak to off peak. And then there's the, I guess, net hourly, which of which the peak to off peak shifting would be a subset. But as I understand it, and again, my understanding is limited, that's also an interesting investigation or something that can be learned just from the shifting from peak to off peak, in addition to the net hourly. But Steve Sunderhoff crossed out those items and is now treating it as the first line is the tons and the second line is dollars. But that's actually not how the rest of the spreadsheet would work. If you have tons and you're going to dollars, that would appear on the same row. That's not really the purpose of having a separate row. So we need to talk about that, and then as that relates to the narrative as well. So
Yeah, if you want to, yeah, this is Steve Sunderoff. Yeah, Ed Tracy provided those edits. Ed, are you on at this point?
I am, and I was going to keep you from going underneath the bus. Judge Lawrence, that was me making those edits, not Steve.
Okay.
So what I was trying to do, and again, it may be part of the part of my issue may just not been the first part of this discussion way back when these things were laid out. So again, just trying to get an understanding of what we're actually looking to calculate and submit. So the way I look at it is basically we have three pollutants. We're looking at carbon, SO2, and NOx. And we want to calculate the tons. And we were going to do this on an hourly basis, is what we propose. Is every hour we'll know how much we charge or discharge. We'll apply the appropriate emission rate and come up with emissions for each hour. We will know if we're peak shaving. We'll know if we're doing frequency regulation, but we were just going to calculate it hour by hour. And right now we weren't going to split that out. We were going to have an annual number saying, here's the emissions impacts from the battery project. So that's kind of my viewpoint coming in and trying to modify this.
Okay. Can I turn to Mr. Cleaver? Were you starting to say something? Or
yeah, I just wanted to confirm that, Your Honor, when you were reading off of the PHI BGE edited version of the spreadsheet, I just wanted to make sure I was following along on the right document. But
that is where I was. Okay, yeah. Are you there?
Yeah, I got it. Thank you.
Okay. So I was trying to, I guess I think I was clarifying my understanding of their changes. And then I think what we need to address, and maybe Dave Littell can address it, the two different ways to measure. Yes, there are three different pollutants, but the different ways to measure what's happening with those. So Dave, did you want to?
Sure, yeah. I mean, and the reason we went back and added those two lines is that I was comparing our original submission to this and realized that we put a lot of focus in the original submission on measuring the peak to off peak. So I I mean, I wanted to at least have a discussion with this group on whether we're going to not recommend that anymore and make a purposeful decision to the commission, because it's very possible a commissioner would say, well, you know, your last submission, you really focused on the shift from peak to off peak, and in this one now we have moved to the measure that Ed described. And I realized that they were different, as Judge Lawrence said. One is a subset of the other. My recommendation is, because it is possible to identify charges during a peak period, I should say charges during an off-peak period and discharges during a peak, that we would separately measure those. It does measure something different, and it does tell us whether we can effectively reduce emissions by charging on off-peak and using that charge on peak. So, and that is an issue that certainly comes up nationally, regionally. So we added those two columns so we can have this discussion. So the question is whether we want to measure it both ways. Of course, we want to look at overall emissions, which Ed just spoke about. We wouldn't recommend that we not do that. The question is whether we want to measure the peak to off peak as a subset of that to determine whether it actually reduces emissions, which is something that, you know, is asserted, and we would determine whether it's true or not. That's the question, whether we want to do that.
Okay, so Ed, back to you. Are the utilities opposed to collecting that data as well?
No, I think the data will be there, and I just want to dive just a little bit deeper. So when we do each hourly emissions calculation, we will pick an on-peak or off-peak emission rate. We'll pick an emission rate appropriate for the time of when that is occurring. So I just think that one thing we want to be specific is the one really thing that we're going from off-peak to on-peak is the peak shaving. So those 10 periods a year, I think is what we're 10 or 12 peak shaving events a year. I think, you know, we can pull those out and identify those. I don't think there's an issue getting the emissions just for those events. But then again, there'll be other times when we're going to be charging on peak and off peak just because of the time of day. We're doing frequency regulation. I don't think that's what you want to count in the peak, moving the peak from on peak to off peak. But we'll use an on peak and off peak emission rates. I don't want people to confuse that. That's the only thing I'm a little concerned about.
And that you put your finger on how we're going to identify peaks, and you actually jumped to a spot I hadn't anticipated, which is just to measure your peak shaving events as defined. What I had recommended was that we use the peak periods that are defined in the TOU pilot, and then someone came back, I can't remember who, Nissan perhaps, or utilities, and said, no, there's, you know, another accepted peak. So we do have to decide what we're using for how to measure which peaks we're moving to off-peak event.
Yeah. Sorry, this has been with staff. Could this be maybe clarified to say we want to see the net overall, whether there was an increase or a decrease? But also, it sounds like, David, where you were trying to go is identifying emissions by operations. So if you're trying to do peak shaving, like maybe we have beneficial when you're doing peak shaving, because that's usually when you have your peakers are running, which are dirty plants. So then therefore you're going to, but doing the frequency regulation, which is where a majority of these plants are going to spend most of their time, you really aren't going to have a lot of this peak to off peak shifting. You'll have the round trip efficiency losses, but otherwise they're going to just be eating up whatever emissions they do, I guess, either avoid or charge during the day when they're doing those slight, I guess, charge and discharges.
I think that's right, Ben. I think you captured it. So there's going to be specific incidents, and probably what David's going after is, I want to say there's 10 to 12 peak events that the battery will be charged to full load, and then it'll be, if it's called on, it'll be discharged, the following day or whatever that time is. And we'll need to know that because the way we calculate emissions, will change for peak shaving versus just frequency regulation. So if we want to call that out, just overall emissions, which is again what my focus was here, and then also calculating, just the peak, the peak shaving events, I think that's fine.
And again, I just observe our original recommendation, or at least make sure we have an answer to the commission if they ask it. So Ed, you put on the table just using the peak shaving events as a way to, as those events. I'm fine with that. That's actually a very simple, straightforward solution to how to identify those. It would be less data intensive than what I was thinking. So I just want to identify that for comment by everyone to make sure we have.
Yeah, OPC, is that fine with OPC?
So, good morning, Judge, and good morning, everyone. This is Steve Lieutenant from Synapse. Yes, we believe it's important to understand the emission impacts from the different uses of the battery energy storage system. So I think that's been captured in this discussion that we'd like to see the emission impacts from peak shifting off peak to on peak, and also what the emissions impact would be from, say, using the battery to provide regulation services in PJM. And in the methodology, we understand would be different between those two types of applications, and we just want to make sure that we are capturing the emissions impacts using the appropriate methodology for the various uses of the battery throughout an annual cycle. So I think that's where folks are heading.
Well, actually, I think we were heading away from shifting peak to off-peak and moving to peak shaving.
No,
Sure.
I think it's still the shift. Peak shaving and shifting peak to off peak are the same thing, at least with energy storage, because they'll have to have charged that battery at another time to do that. So I think I've to keep the terminology straight. I guess it would be there will be times where the storage is legitimately trying to move or charge off peak to then discharge on peak, which would then be a peak shaving event. And then in the alternative, there will be times where the storage is charging and discharging randomly, could be on peak, could be off peak, to basically play in to perform market, to play in the market, which could be for I guess for all these batteries, it's likely going to be regulation, but there are some other services they could theoretically provide. And I guess where Steve was going is that in the Exelon utilities captured this in their analysis. They provided two. Well, we can debate if we agree with how they're using marginal and average, but at least the math, I think, is they're attempting to capture the those two different functions. I do have a question for them about their math as I look through it again, but
yeah,
I think that's what they're trying to do. Yeah.
We'll get to the narrative next. I just want to make sure that Dave is clear on how we're going to modify the spreadsheet, because I can't say that I am. Yes. Okay. He's nodding. All right. So if we go to the spreadsheet, Ben, are you talking about the calculation that on page 5 that the utilities modified?
Yeah, and it's not clear to me that when that's all said and done, that their revisions have actually captured the concerns staff had a while ago. Maybe it did. I just can't. Looking at, I think what Dave had originally given us did capture that, but now I'm having looked through what they're proposing. I'm not sure that it does that, and that's what I'm concerned, because basically there's, for most of the storage units, unless they're charging and discharging off peak in the summer, it's going to be a round trip loss of emissions, because they're going to have to charge more off peak than on peak. But I think the Exelon, and then I think maybe this gets to the second part of my issue, which is the Exelon utilities have proposed to use an off peak average emissions and not a marginal emissions, but then they compare that to a marginal emissions on peak. And so to me, I don't think you can mix and match average into marginal like that. Whether we agree to use average or marginal going forward, I don't think you can pick and choose to use them differently within the equation. So there's two issues happening there with that equation. Or maybe there's only one, but
and OPC had a similar comment. Ed, can you walk through the calculation in the narrative then?
Correct. Yeah, I think I actually see 3 issues. So that sounds like
sure, more is better.
Yeah, of course. So in terms of round trip efficiency, originally, our assumption back in their February 1 filing was, well, use that number in the equation, but when we went back and looked at it and realized that we're metering both the energy that's charging the battery and discharging the battery, that round trip efficiency is already built in. So, you know, if we charge it for, like I say, in this example, like a megawatt, put a megawatt hour into the battery, we're going to only get 0.85 out if we have a round trip efficiency of 85%. So that's the one thing, just it's a little bit of difference is you're not going to see round trip efficiency used in the calculation because it's already built in the metering, the way the battery's metering. So are folks comfortable with that?
I think so, and that's captured, Ed, in the fact that you're saying off peak you charged a megawatt hour, but on peak you discharge 0.85 megawatt hours. That's how we're capturing it right there.
Yeah,
I agree.
Right, yeah, it doesn't even matter when you're charging it. It's just because you're charging in, you're measuring how much you're putting in, and you're measuring how much you're going out. That's automatically you're going to capture that inefficiency in the charging. So that's there. In terms of the emission rates, and this is a good conversation because when we look at peak shaving, well, let me go back to frequency regulation is the easiest one. When you do frequency regulation, the battery is going to be around 50%, and it's just going to go up and down. So our thought was that it really isn't the marginal unit. I mean, you're basically charging and discharging so quick that basically the system average emission rate is probably the most reflective of what those emissions are at the time on the grid. Because again, when you're with the battery frequency deregulation so fast that you're not moving marginal units on and off because of frequency regulation. So we want to use the system-wide average for that PJM provides.
And I think I think I'm okay with that, but I guess OPC filed comments where they were concerned with that. So I'm curious where they're at.
Yes, yeah, we had an internal conversation, and we believe that the appropriate emissions rate would be the marginal emissions rate. That the battery storage is considered in that case the marginal unit, and so it's our understanding that you would want to credit the round trip losses with the emissions based on the marginal rate. So I think maybe there's just a little difference in terms of understanding of the technical functioning of the grid and what the battery storage would actually be serving as a regulation resource would actually be displacing.
Yeah.
This is Kathleen Wayness. Can I make a comment, please? Yeah, good. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
In regards to this, I guess the thing is right now we're talking about frequency regulation, which is brief. So that's not something that when we're using the marginal on and marginal off, that seems to be right now, we're still dealing with a monthly value. When you're looking at a frequency regulation, it's minute by minute or 5 minute by 5 minutes. It's very abbreviated. So I think we need, maybe I missed, but if we're talking about frequency regulation, I'm not going to make a comment, but when we're talking about peak shaving and peak shifting and everything else, I looked at what Exelon had recommended, and I do agree that the average would be more reflective and a better judgment of what's actually going on than just looking at the peak unit. And I could go into great detail, but I know it's not necessary, but I'm just putting in my sense.
I mean, I'd be happy to go back and talk with our experts on this issue and respond back in terms of OBC's support of that approach.
Excellent. Is that something you can do quickly? Like today? Later
Yes.
today? I hate to put the pressure on, but we got to file something next week, so
yeah,
we need to come to consensus.
Okay.
If you need something from me, Steve, let me know. And then the last piece.
So staff, you're okay with the calculation on page 5? I don't want to misstate.
Well, no, because I still have a problem with the marginal off. I disagree with him. I agree with, this is why we need a distinction in the equation. When we're talking about regulation, I think I might be okay with average because I agree we're within the hour, it's bouncing around. And so it's going to be kind of hard to get down to that detail where you forcing things on and off. And so I get the argument there for the regulation service. What I disagree with is that you can compare the marginal rate off peak to the average rate, or sorry, the average rate off peak to the marginal rate on peak, because those are just two different things in the argument. There's no difference in the argument. So if we're going to use average off peak, then we need to use average on peak. And if we're going to use marginal on peak, then we need to use marginal off peak. I don't think you can claim that, well, we didn't know what we were we didn't know we were adding load to the grid, or what we were adding to the grid off peak, but we knew what we were definitely offsetting on peak. So if we're going to try and make those kinds of claims, then it either needs to be average or marginal, but it can't be average to marginal. At least that's how I'm looking at it right now. It's just theoretically, I can't agree with that kind of a thing. So
So Ben, back to sort of, here's my thoughts. And again, I'm comfortable actually either way, but the way I looked at when you're doing the peak shaving is, I think obviously when you're moving load from off peak to on peak, when you're discharging into the market, you are displacing that marginal unit. That's the whole idea behind peak shaving. So I'm very comfortable with that. But when we're charging the battery, this is where I think we have a little bit less comfort is, you're not in a peak situation. So you're basically pulling off the grid and you're with every other source. So, which source is actually supplying us the battery? Again, I know that people make the argument the other way. So I'm comfortable. And again, Steve,
I guess, Ed, none of these units are really like, a peaker plant is what, like 50 megawatts? None of our units that we're running here are probably actually going to kick a unit on or off the grid with a peak shave. We might convince them, we might actually convince them to lower their operations by, I think in grand total, we have maybe 6 megawatts here of storage. And so I guess I get where you're coming from on the margin. I get it. But I think once again, kind of going back to what Kathleen was saying, I've read, trying to understand what PJM did. It looked like they were looking at the marginal unit every 5 minutes and then took an average across the month. David?
I just want to say, I understand both arguments, and without weighing in, I just want to ask, are we going to have good average emission data for, I know we're going to have good marginal data if PJM follows through on its aspiration. They told us that we'd have good, periodic, I think it's at least hourly marginal data, but are they also going to publish averages, or is that a data intensive calculation that would have to be done? Because I would want to use hourly averages. I wouldn't want to use daily or monthly averages. That introduces a over average. I can't remember what the statistical term is for that.
No, that's fair, David. We've asked PJM because right now when they produce the monthly numbers, they produce a marginal on peak, marginal off peak, and a system-wide average. They're doing that monthly. We've asked them to do the same thing hourly. So we would have hourly for each one. So again, if you don't get that hourly system-wide average, then I agree. Then that becomes a little bit more of an issue because it's not apples to apples. So I think
so. That's a footnote in our recommendations, but I would want that to be, because as I said, I understand both arguments. I think they're both legitimate. I don't think either is going to give us a wildly off measure. But if we can't get average hourly, then that would push me in the direction of marginal, because I don't want to use a monthly average or even a daily average.
Right.
Okay, so does it sound like since the utilities don't have a strong position, we'll go with the average, but we'll deal with it in the narrative that you could use marginal?
I think it's, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so frequency, I think everybody's comfortable. If we have hourly, we'll use the system-wide average. And again, I think we're comfortable if PSC and others staff wanted to use marginal on and off peak for when we're charging for charging events, for peak shaving events, then we can do that. That's not an issue.
Okay.
So Ed, so is PJM creating system average hourly emissions, or are they creating only marginal? I guess I've not tried to figure out what PJM is trying to create yet. So I don't know where they're at.
That's a good question. And that's what we've asked, because they said they'll provide the 5-minute data, which we asked to be aggregated up to an hour. And we've also asked them to do the average hourly emission rate. Again, just correspond what they're doing monthly. We asked them to correspondingly do it hourly.
Okay.
Okay, so
Yeah, I guess it's really going to depend on what, I mean, maybe for the narrative, Judge, it might just be worth stating it's going to depend on what hourly data PJM is able to provide.
yeah,
And
I was going
so-
to turn to Nitsan. I think if you're clear on that, I think we've taken care of the issue at the bottom of page 4, the narrative, and the calculation on page 5, right? Nitsan?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Perfect.
Is that, do I say that right? We've kind of moved through your set on how to revise the narrative with respect to those.
Yeah, I'll touch base with David, but I think I got it.
Okay. Okay. Is there so is there anything else left on emissions?
Excuse me, Your Honor.
Yes, Joe.
Just so I'm clear, can someone articulate now, after all the discussion, what exactly, Your Honor, you just said, I think we're clear on the narrative. Just so I'm clear, can you say what that is? Because I've heard different kind of seeming
Okay.
shifting.
Let's say what I think, and then people can jump in when I'm wrong. So I have both staff's changes and PHI and BGE comments up. And if I look at page 4 of PHI and BGEs, we've sort of talked about that issue and the formula. And I think where we're coming down is that there's 2 ways you could calculate it, and the utilities don't feel strongly with regard to regulation. So for regulation, we're going to use average. It's so long as the data is available from PJM. There'll be a notation, at least in the narrative, that reflects that if for some reason only marginal is available, that's what we'll use. However, when we get to peak shaving, we have to use marginal. How am I doing so far? Ed?
Ed, I'm good with that.
Okay. Is that and then I was getting to, is there something else we need to do besides those issues?
The other thing else, and this gets back to the dollars, when we looked at the rows, the one thing, again, I think there's 3 different, I guess, societal impacts I see we're looking at. One of them is the societal cost of carbon, which is, I think that's straightforward. I don't think we ever came up with, and David can weigh in, with something specific for NOx. It's something we're going to watch for. And then the last piece was, I think it's really relates to particulates, is this what the EPA is changing, and what I think the working group originally used was the on-peak, off-peak shifting, the dollars per kWh number, which is public health benefits, which again, I think wasn't specific to battery storage. It was more energy efficiency. So that's, in my mind, there's the 3 things we're looking to do. And right now we only have one, which is carbon, which we calculate.
Okay, yeah, NOx is, there's been some offline discussions regarding NOx and using Empower data. Ben, can you address that?
Yes, thanks. So Empower is within the next couple of months looking to come up with individual values for SOx, NOx, and PM 2.5. So at that point, I mean, granted, we have to make sure we understand the baseline assumptions underneath those, but what the end goal of those 3 values is we should have $1 per kilowatt hour value that we can use to say, here's the cost of those 3. And then I guess from Empower sense, they're looking to use it for avoided cost. For us, we would be looking to figure out what the net cost of this grid is, correct? So whether it be a reduction or not. So I guess if we're able to track the emissions output of NOx, SOx, and PM, or the emissions impacts of NOx, SOx, and PM for the energy storage units by hour or aggregate, I guess, we should be able to use those $ per kilowatt hour values. Now, they're not going to be ready for a little while, but they'll probably be ready by the time we're around to when we start getting data in 2003.
And I guess that gets to staff's comment that how are we going to deal with the continually updating Empower data going forward?
Correct. So I mean, yeah. So I guess on our comments, one of the thing, and this is actually a lot of the avoided cost assumptions have been changing. We have been noticing in Empower, such as BG no longer has an on, at least if it stands, BG might no longer, and maybe PHI might no longer have an on to off peak energy rate. It will just be on and off peak will be the same value maybe. And so that would obviously wreak havoc on what we're trying to accomplish here. And so that also implies that the definitions of on and off peak might be not the same between the two. So what I was trying to get to with our comments is it's not inappropriate to look to Empower for our values, but before we just take their value and put it into our math, we need to really understand the mechanics underneath it and say, is this correct, or do we need to change? Do we need to modify it to fit within our paradigm, or do we need to go find another source because what Empower's doing with it is not what we can do with it? Because I think there's been a couple times where I run into issues. I think another part we captured in it was, I know our benefits when we were talking about peak capacity, we're talking about PJM peak benefits, but some of the utilities included the total cost, which included distribution benefits. So I think it's just one of those things where unless people really understand what that Empower number represents when they get it, and then they look underneath the hood, just blindly pulling it into our analysis is going to create problems going forward, I think. So that was the point of our thing, which is if we're going to use it, we really empower people before we use the data to make sure it is actually reflective of how we want to use it.
And what's your suggestion for looking at that going forward? Reconvening the working group?
I was thinking, I guess there's a couple. I mean, one, it could be reconvene the work group once a year to say, here's the Empower assumptions we're using. Does that still work? Another option is there is an Empower evaluation group that meets almost on a biweekly basis right now. And so if the utilities were to, before they use the Empower values, check in with the independent evaluator and or their people and get a narrative of what the costs represent that they're looking at, and make sure it's clearly documented what their on and off peak assumptions are, then maybe when they submit their annual updates, they could have an appendix or something that explains all this. So parties know if something Empower changed. So I think that's where just something that documents what's happening inside those Empower assumptions and what they represent, I think should work. So either we could do it through a work group process once a year, or we could, I guess the utilities could say in a narrative form, here's what those assumptions represent and here's how they've changed since we've last used them. David? Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, how did the utilities feel about that?
So if it were, this is Steve, if it were an annual process, right, where we had clarity on what figures everyone wanted to agree to use, that's fine. We just need that far enough in advance of the report so that we can make sure that it's properly reflected in what we provide in our annual document, right? So we just need a timing on that. So some clarity on the timing on that would be helpful. If we have a July 1st report, we'd want to have that data available to us, probably in the spring, so that we could add that to all of the, whatever we're reporting out.
Steve, this is Nitzan. I think in the report currently it says, in the narrative it says that if the data changes mid-year or if something happens in terms of how we think about the Empower data, that you continue to collect the data as you had in the year until the filing, and then you would kind of start from zero when your next reporting year starts. Is that a reasonable resolution for you? Okay.
Yeah. So Nitzan, I just don't want to be in the position of having to change the data set for a reporting cycle. So if we're reporting, right now, I guess the reporting date is effective July 1st. We want all of the data in that file to basically reflect the appropriate valuation as of July 1st back in time, right? So just kind of a once and done each year. So long as we know that by about the spring of each year, so that we can enter that into the whatever report we're preparing, so all the calculations are tracking through, right?
Steve, I think that makes sense. And the goal of this, and I think it was an issue of when we were, because me and Danner deal with the Empower team a lot, and I keep
Right.
we ran across the avoided costs are changing, and then we ran into and so I just was like, this is going to have problems for whatever happens with energy storage, especially if some of these assumptions stand.
Yeah,
So
no, I agree with that.
Yeah.
So an annual review, but early enough in time so that all of the annual reporting data, then, however we're reporting it out, can be adjusted to reflect whatever values are appropriate there.
Okay, so it sounds like in the next version of the narrative, Steve, you or someone with utilities needs to revise bottom of page 4, top of page 5 to clarify, I don't know if you want to say April for the July 1 report, because right now it's, I guess, not completely clear. And then also what Ben is looking for, which is that there would be detail provided on in narrative form on the Empower figure so that everyone understands.
I think this is Nita. I think Ben added 2 paragraphs that everyone should review because I'm just going to drop it into the report otherwise. So if you have any issues with it, you should review it and send to you, Judge Lawrence, any comments offline, or if they want to look at it now. But I think, Ben, right, you captured your comments in 2 paragraphs.
Yeah, so top of page 7 is where I dropped in the recommendation about we need to be careful with Empower assumptions, and maybe we just need to add a line to it that kind of documents if where we're going is the work group will meet once a year in the spring to review them and give it its blessing. Maybe that's an ad there or something. But I think it would be helpful that it's just documented in whatever's filed, just so whoever comes next will be able to know what we did. And then the one after that has to do with the capacity assumptions that are within the avoided peak capacity assumptions from Empower. And just, we were highlighting an issue that we ran into when we were reviewing Potomac Edison's. And so that was just another, and that was basically the Empower costs, peak capacity costs include distribution capacity. And so we were going back and forth on, well, is it appropriate for the utilities to basically claim an avoided distribution benefit or claim no avoided distribution benefit, but then also claim this theoretical avoided peak capacity cost for distribution because the Empower assumptions are basically energy efficiency is scattered throughout the entire system. And so in order to try and capture that avoided distribution, we've given them basically a peak capacity value for that. And so we were thinking it makes, unless the utilities had a strong argument for why that capacity value should stand from the Empower assumptions, it probably makes sense to drop the capacity cost from that avoided peak capacity assumption when doing the math. But from where we were sitting, it looked like if you've already determined if your project avoids distribution or doesn't, that you shouldn't also be capturing the avoided peak capacity for distribution as well.
And Ben, for clarity, is that the draft language that you proposed that it is what you submitted to Judge Lawrence that she circulated?
Yeah, that's the bottom of page 7. And that was a new issue that came up recently. So, I mean, if you guys, maybe we're missing something, but that's just when we looked at it.
Yeah, why don't we take that offline and take a close look at your language, and if we have any issues with it, how about we reach back to you, Ben, on clarity on that? Okay.
And then you'll get back to the rest of us, because otherwise,
we will.
Right. As Nissan said, that language will probably get added in.
Judge Lawrence.
Yes.
Before we just moved to the capacity cost obligation, but back on emissions. As much as we can clarify in the narrative and keep the narrative intact, I think. But I just wanted to remind everyone we're working on in column H and a number of these. It refers to a methodology. It'll be used, and the utilities have agreed and are working on, but we don't have in front of us a methodology document where that's exactly why we want to lay out these calculations to make sure we're all on the same page for how things are calculated. So It might be that we refer to that document in the narrative, but it's going to be, I mean, that's going to be something that I think a subset of us are very interested in getting right. And it's important for all the reasons we're going over, just simply to make sure we're on the same page.
Yeah, if I could, thanks, Dave, to get back to that, at the last meeting or even the one before, I thought the utilities agreed that the February 1 filing is already obsolete, and to refer to it in the spreadsheet is less than ideal, and really there needs to be a separate document. We just don't have that yet. Ed, is that still coming?
Yes, I think what we maybe got a little off track is we tried to put some of that narrative into the I'm sorry, we started putting some of that information into the narrative. It sounds like it's better off to be in a separate document and keep the narrative a little bit tighter or a little bit more general, and then do more specifics.
I think so.
Okay, we can do that. Yes.
Okay, and what's your timing on that?
It's Thursday. I think probably by like Monday next week, early next week. Or you want something sooner?
Monday at the latest. We have
Okay.
to turn in our entire thing on Wednesday.
Judge, is it, or Your Honors, is it some, I mean, knowing that we want to get something like that right, is that something where we like indicate that the work group is like theoretically we're all there, but this spreadsheet that kind of gets into the details might be just a tad later, so parties have an opportunity to go through it? I mean,
we can do that if we have to. I'd like
okay.
to push forward as much as we can, and then if we have to say it'll be coming, we can.
Yeah, it would be better to include everything at this point. If there's something that's unknown, we should note that, right? So yeah,
Always.
right. It's better for a whole package, I think. And
No,
then
I would like it in one document.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing on obsolete, right? So the change, the real essence
Was
of the
that
change.
strong? I'm sorry, that might have been too strong.
Yeah, that was right. So I just want to, Ed, we didn't know for sure at the point in time that Ed put that together, that we would have hourly data from PJM. That was kind of the heart of the difference right there, right?
Yeah. Okay, so I think we're done with emissions. Someone yell
Wait,
for
sorry,
another.
Judge Lawrence. What's the revisions? Sorry, I have a quick question. Did we end up resolving the NOx, the Empower NOx issue? I just want to make sure I heard.
The details of the Empower NOx issue and whether to use the dollar value.
Yeah, does the working group agree that assuming Empower separates between PM, NOx, and SOx, that when that data becomes available, the working group will convene and the utilities will adopt that?
I think what Ben was willing to do was accept a narrative from the utilities so long as it was sufficiently detailed. Did I get that wrong?
Yeah, I think let me relay back where I think we're at, and then everyone can tell me if I'm wrong. We'll meet once a year to basically agree or basically go through the Empower assumptions and basically say, yeah, these make sense, or no, they don't, and we need to modify them. Then the utilities will, in their filings, just have a document that says, here's what we used and like a quick blurb of why it's appropriate. And then on the SOx, NOx, and PM, once they're available, we would have basically once they're available, those assumptions would be if those assumptions, those dollar values, so long as they meet the criteria we agree to when we meet once a year, we would use them in the calculations.
Okay, and the meeting once a year probably needs to happen in March, so that we have a resolution by April. Is that right, Steve?
That would be ideal, right?
Okay.
So that we can line everything up for the report, right?
But should we mention in the narrative for this filing that those emissions are going to be separated, or should we not mention that? Sorry for asking.
You could mention that there is a potential they will be I would just say there's a potential they will be separated, and that if it becomes available, that the work group will consider using it for the
Okay, because I do think it'd be ideal to show that we do have a path forward to identifying a dollar value for these, assuming that we're all in agreement that they're applicable. So I would like to put it in the report, as long as I'm not going against what the group is saying.
Yes.
On that, Dave, if we're able to get a dollar value for SOx and PM 2.5, do we need to use the EPA tool for public health benefits, are we getting, because my understanding was the public health benefits were encapsulating NOx or SOx and PM 2.5. So if we're able to get a dollar value, do we need to continue to look to that EPA tool? Are there additional benefits that that tool is capturing that PM and SOx would not?
Yeah,
okay.
I would recommend that we do that if EPA does finalize the tool. The utilities have noted they want everyone to look at that first. The reason is that the EPA tool, you're more familiar with the details of what Empower does to calculate those, but I'm quite sure that the public health benefits, which are the primary measure in the EPA tool, are valued more comprehensively than the numbers that I've seen out of Empower, just eyeballing the numbers. So I would recommend we look at that if EPA finalizes the tool. It's somewhat analogous to the difference between the RISI price and the social cost of carbon. That's not a perfect analogy, but
yeah, no, I think that's fine. I think we probably just needs on when you write the narrative, just to make it clear that there will need to be, if the EPA tool becomes available, we need to balance the use of that tool against the use of the SOx PM, basically against the use of the dollar values from Empower, to make sure we're not double counting the values between the two streams. That's all.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
Okay. So moving on from emissions, trying to knock out some of maybe the easier items. The utilities had a change which inserted related to load growth on the additional utility investments above 500,000. And I just need to clarify, is this something the working group agreed, or there's any issue with that language?
I mean, staff would like to see it smaller, but I don't think we're going to have any consternations about it. I mean, I guess if the project is load growth related, I think that's what really matters. Are we avoiding the load growth related projects? So I guess, are there typically load growth related projects under $500,000?
I don't know who from the utility wants to respond to that. Steve, are you still with us? No.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Here I am.
Oh.
Yeah. So our thinking was, yeah, and I don't think that below 500,000 is likely to be load growth related. We were just trying to come up with a point where we weren't reporting kind of incidental matters. And
I think we're fine on the 500. Your changed language was related to load growth.
Yeah, we just added load growth as the clarifying language, right?
And so if everybody's fine with that, great.
Yeah. So Steve, let me just make sure. So for the reporting purposes, like basically what you'll say in a piece of paper filed with the commission is, here's what happened. But if an engineer of staff wanted to look at the details, could they look at the details if they asked you?
They should be able to look at the details, right? So I'm not a distribution engineer, so I don't know who was on the line, but yeah, they should be able to look at the details related to our planned investments to handle the load growth for that change, right? So that should be available. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so if they decide they wanted to look at stuff smaller, they could contact you and talk to you about seeing that off. But that just won't be in the filing, is what we're talking about here.
Right. And so the idea, and the reason the insert for load growth is, we're replacing poles because they're damaged or whatever. That isn't really load growth related, right? So we don't want to capture that here.
Okay, the next item I have on my list is that the utilities made some changes to the narrative. I'm at the bottom of 14 on their version. And I guess what I'd like from you, Ben, is to let, I guess, them know if you have any, this relates to power quality, whether you have any issues with their edits now or at a later time. I don't know.
Is DeAndre or John Bortowski on? They might not be. Okay. I know in our narrative, I guess same question needs to be directed to the utilities, because I know we also submitted edits in that section. I think in our narrative, it's bottom of page 16, it's 16 to 17. There was some site operation metrics put in there. Now I think we're all mostly in agreement on this, if not in agreement. So I'll need my engineers to give me a thumbs up, and I'll ask them to look at the utilities language. And so Steve, if you can have your team look at our language on 16 and 17, I think that would be good.
Yep. Well,
And
we can
then-
have our engineering guys look at that. Yep.
Okay.
Thanks.
So is that whole site operations metrics, you added a new page on the spreadsheet. The utilities are familiar with that?
They should be.
Okay. And they're going to let us know if they have a problem with it.
Yeah. And we'll look at that. And what lines is that right now on the spreadsheet from staff?
And
That's a new
we
page.
sent, we added, Steve, the Excel document we sent you guys a couple weeks ago. We added those as extra tabs to the workbook.
Okay. So we
And
need
the
very
one we sent
red.
to the judge.
Yeah, you can't miss them. They're very red at the bottom.
Okay.
There's three
Yeah.
new. And I'm assuming, Ben, what you intend is that these will be printed out and they'll be like attachments B, C, D, and E.
Yeah, or they would be at least electronically provided to the parties. I don't know if anything but the summary pages, because I know one of those pages is an 8760, and I don't see much value in having an 8760 printed on paper.
Okay.
And so,
Just the metric summary and the islanding summary?
I think those make most. I think, yeah, anything that gets into hourly data doesn't need to be printed, in my opinion. I just wanted to make sure we can get it.
Okay.
Okay.
And right now they're blank, right?
Right, they're not populated. And
Okay, so
basically
we would
anything
be-
where it says monthly, the idea is they would create 12 monthly tabs of data.
Okay. But the value is in showing everyone in the filing what is intended, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
And then one thing I wanted to raise for you, Judge, is we've reached a tentative agreement between staff and I think amongst the parties that the utilities would only install one power quality meter. But I guess this is a question for you and the lawyers. Is the PUA specifically says we will need to measure whether the project altered the quality or availability of electricity supply. And so the question that I had, and I was asking people about, was, does that mean that we need to do that for each project, or can we kind of just broadly discuss that amongst all the projects? Because if we can just broadly discuss that amongst all the projects, then I think one power quality meter probably per utility probably allows us to have that discussion. But if we have to do that specifically for each project, then I have concerns that we would actually need a power quality meter per project. Elk Neck, I think we would just have to tell the General Assembly it's impossible because that just won't work. But I think that was just an issue that I think the lawyers need to weigh in on, because I think it's just a question of, are we complying with statute by only putting one power quality meter in per project, or per utility, and not per project.
Well, you might need to check with your lawyers, because I don't think OPC took a position.
Right. Well, they all directed me to you. So,
that's funny.
I know. They all directed me to you.
You know, my interpretation of the statute, it holds no weight.
That's fair.
Yeah,
So-
this is Nissan. I am not a lawyer, but I will say that I think I've been listening quietly to all our conversations over power quality, and I think that we may be taking the legislative language a little too literally. This was it's not my sense that this the part of the statute that talks about this intended to be very quantitative on a per project basis, but if lawyers are needed, then lawyers are needed.
So I guess I can put that out to the utility lawyers. I'll take it back again to my guys, and Joe, you all should, Mr. Cleaver, you should also look at it.
No, they haven't raised the issue. They've waived their right to talk about it anymore.
No,
right,
okay.
Joe?
And
I'm just
just to make sure we're all on the same page, this is the sentence: whether the project altered the quality or availability of electricity supply. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the
yeah.
sentence that is subject to interpretation at the moment.
necessarily that we
I think
are
the
okay.
parties are going to have to, come to an agreement on that.
Okay.
I can't really help you out. I'm sorry.
So just for clarity, we had agreed to put one power quality meter per utility on one of the battery sites, right?
Correct.
And so you're not changing kind of that recommendation, right?
I'm not recommend. So how about Steve? What I'm asking is, are we complying with the law if we all agree with that, or are we going to run into an issue in 5 years when we submit a report to the General Assembly and they say, well, we wanted to know this information for all your projects and you only told it to us for 4 of your projects? Are we going to run into an issue with it? And that's my question. If we're not going to run into that issue, then I think that agreement's fine, Steve. But if we're going to run into that issue, then I want to know now and make sure that we deal with it now.
Well, I guess my question is,
yeah.
would the utilities, in answering the question of whether one of their pilot projects altered the quality of availability of electricity supply, would they ever say, I don't know?
I think that's the issue, is no one's had other than staff trying to come up with power quality metrics through the meters, no one's had a way, no one has had an idea of what to do.
Yeah, my sense is that there's no way the utilities are going to come back and say, I don't know. We don't know, because there is the statute here and they have to be able to answer that question. So whether we've come up with the best way or the only way or simply the most feasible from a cost perspective way is kind of a separate issue. But I can't imagine the lawyers for the utilities would advise them to just let it go.
My suspicion is that if they run into power quality issues on the other non-monitored sites, that they'll deploy some of their other meters to figure those out. Obviously, we're not anticipating that, but that would be my suspicion on how that would play out, Ben. And that's right, when the issue would come up, is if you have residents on the same circuit complaining about power quality issues or running into them. So, I mean, I think there's a solution to that problem if it occurs.
Okay, I'm raising it so none of us are caught flat-footed if this becomes a problem later. And then the other part of this, and this is for you, Steve. I know when we discussed this a couple weeks ago, our engineers were looking for the power quality meters to go in ASAP at the location, so we can have some before metrics and after metrics at the locations. Are they utilities able to commit to getting those power quality meters in at the locations?
Yeah,
I guess ahead of time.
So we had a challenge with knowing where those would be placed then prior to the installation of the batteries. So our suggestion was, we'll have a lot of data, 8760, right? And there'll be many hours where the batteries aren't functioning, either discharge or charging cycle. So there'll be a lot of comparative data available where those power meters are installed, power monitoring meters are installed, that'll provide both times when it's being discharged or charged and other times when it's not active at all. And we could provide, we'll have that comparative data. Do you think that's sufficient? Yeah.
Well, wouldn't the performance in the regulation market kind of blow that out of the water? Because my understanding is you guys are going to be, the storage is hopefully going to be constantly bidding itself into the regulation market if it's not being used for the distribution services. And my understanding is that could happen, well, almost constantly throughout a day. Just because you're in the regulation market doesn't mean you get called, but
right. So in the regulation market, when you're in the regulation market, right, you don't necessarily get called. So there'll be many hours, we think, where there won't be any calls on the battery charging or discharging throughout that 8760. Now, in an ideal year, when you have an opportunity to derive more money in the regulation market, you get called more frequently, but other periods you may not get called at all, right? So there should be many hours, and can't obviously guarantee it, but there'll be many hours where there's no active use of the battery, each of the battery systems. So we should have a lot of data comparatively on when it's charging, when it's discharging, and then when it's not doing anything. So the thought there is that that would provide the comparative data that you might be looking for on power quality issues. That's kind of our current thinking.
Okay, and the main reason we can't get the meters in at the sites or near the sites today is because you don't actually know, is the issue that you know where you're going to build this, but you don't know where you're going to tap the line? Is that the
Right,
concern?
right, and yeah, Luke, you're on also if you want to jump in. But the idea is we don't know exactly where those power quality meters would be placed vis-a-vis the battery energy storage unit, and so that determination difficult to make right now. And so the thinking is that when we put the batteries in, we put the power quality meter in, that we'll have comparative data. But prior to that, we don't know really where we would place that power quality meter.
Luke Hasemeyer from BGE here, and just to chime into Steve's comment, the power quality meters that we would be looking to install are all secondary connected. They're designed for use at 480 volts and below, and not all of the locations that we're looking at here, we have an existing location where we could actually do that install, because again of that, because we still have to build, the tap for the new BESS system.
All right, yeah, without John or DeAndre on here, I can't give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So I will get this back to them today so that they can get back to you guys today or tomorrow with an answer.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so then, Judge, for this section, Your Honor, I think we're okay with the one power quality thing, but I do think I'll double check with my lawyers on it to see if they're willing to give me a more definitive answer about the issue that I raised. But
Yeah,
it might
I mean, one
be
of the things you might
worth
want
putting in the narrative for the commission to be aware, so that if they decide they don't agree with where we went, they can correct us.
Oh, yes. Well, they can always do that. I was going to say that I hope that in arranging the spreadsheet to follow the statute, we haven't somehow implied that we are covering everything, because this is still a working group recommendation, and the statute is the statute. And if there's something in the statute that needs to be complied with and we didn't address it, that doesn't mean it goes away. And I think
Right,
vendors for the
I
utilities
agree with that. Yeah.
Okay.
Wait, sorry, Ben, are you saying add a sentence saying that we're only tracking power quality for 4 of the projects to flag to the commission, that we're not tracking it for all of them, and that they need to make note of the fact that our read of the statutory language is that we're going to focus on power quality, but we're not doing it for all? Like, do you want to spell it out?
I think
No.
that I mean, if you look at page 16, we kind of our edits, we kind of spell that out there for the commission. So I think that they should be aware of the issue. I don't know I don't know how closely the commissioners are looking at the statute when they read this. I think they're going to hope that we did try and capture everything. And so if we think we have a possible issue with the statute, that we are reading it one way, but it could be read another way, we should make them aware of it.
I get this, Nissan. I get that, but I also think we're creating a bit of a straw man here, because we're interpreting the statute to mean power quality, but it could be read differently too. So I don't want to flag this as an issue that's a non-issue if the legislators did not intend for this to be that granular of data point.
I think we could probably put in language to staff's comments that attribute them to staff that might solve this issue.
Yeah, I mean, that's fine too.
Okay.
If you want to put it on us, because we're the ones raising the issue, but yeah.
Okay, fine. That's great. That's a good point. All right, great.
Okay. Oh no, I lost where I was. Okay, so moving on. Sorry to bounce around, but staff had a comment that the 500,000, I think we're back to the deferral, should be aggregated within the time frame covered by the utilities claimed avoided costs. Is that fine with utilities? Steve, come on.
Sorry, trying to unmute. Yeah, that should be fine.
Okay, great. OPC had a comment. OPC recommends that the utilities claiming a distribution or transmission deferral value in their BESS applications are required to provide an annual progress report on any identified project being deferred or voided. Is that fine with utilities?
Sorry, could you state that more slowly?
No.
Sorry.
The OPC, one of their recommendations was that the utilities, when they're claiming a distribution deferral value in your BESS applications, you're required then to provide an annual progress report on any identified project being deferred or avoided.
So not quite clear what that means. So the thought.
Okay, OPC.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we appreciate the utilities' willingness to report on investments for load growth related projects with a threshold of $500,000 or more. But we also think that's important for the utilities to provide a brief narrative about the overall changes and what they're seeing and whether what's happening on the grid on that feeder are consistent with what they had identified in their initial BESS application. So we don't want to, put an onerous burden on the utilities, but we do think just having the investment in itself isn't sufficient, that it would be useful to have some narrative around as load changing different than we had anticipated. This particular investment was required for X, Y, and Z purposes, and the battery wouldn't have been able to defer that. So we're just looking for, given that these deferral values are such a large part of the overall benefit of these investments, and the learnings are important, that we understand how, from what the utilities originally had envisioned, is that kind of evolving and coming to fruition, and just requesting an annually kind of a short narrative that provides that level of detail.
Yeah. So Steve, is that only if the deferral changes, that $500,000 threshold is met, or are you thinking each year we'd provide some report? Because we're not going to know whether we're going to be able to achieve, we're in that deferral unless that load forecasts change sufficiently so that we have to actually plan an investment earlier in time. So I'm just trying to provide clarity. Yeah.
No, we think it would be, again, if not trying to put too much of an onerous burden on the utility, but we do think just a brief narrative annually on here's what we originally had projected in our application, and here's what the current situation is. And it could be things seem to be tracking as we anticipated, or we don't have enough information at this point. So just really an annual narrative that, again, reflects on what the original application had anticipated and any kind of changes or progress that you've seen.
Yeah, not a lot of detail, just kind of a brief review of that. Like you're looking at for a paragraph discussion of that, unless there is a change, that $500,000 change threshold that we originally identified, right? So
I think that would be satisfy our need. Our interest.
Yeah, Luke and Tom, what do you guys think about that?
No, I think as long as I think Steve, you clarified that it's the description or the narrative is only applicable when the dollar threshold of 500,000 is crossed. If that is the case, I think that is what staff was also asking or alluding or suggesting some more details. I think we are in alignment. If you're talking about like the first year of deferral, whatever it is, we might not have any activity there. So I might not have anything to report, because one thing is I've not crossed the threshold and the deferral is working as per planned or whatever it is. So there's no activity. So there's nothing to report. So if it is above 500,000, obviously we would have to provide some narrative, just not say we spent 600,000 for load related expenditure and leave it aside.
Hey, Tom, so what Steve is suggesting is that we just have a brief paragraph that would say, hey, we've taken a look at the updated load forecast. There's no change related to our planned construction for load growth at this time. It's essentially a paragraph of language commenting on what we're seeing related to each specific project. That's all.
That is
And
fine.
it doesn't relate to the $500,000 threshold. He'd like to
Okay.
see that. He'd like to see that regardless of. It's kind of just a status update, and you know, I think we're okay with that. But
Yeah.
I don't know, with Luke, you're still on. You want to offer a comment on that?
I think I'm with you, Steve. I mean, I
Yeah.
think that is something we can do.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine, Steve. OPC. I think we should be able to comply, Judge.
Yeah,
Okay.
we just want to.
Can I clarify? Is it progress report on the project being deferred or avoided?
Yeah. So Steve, you intend to basically have it as basically an additional paragraph of description related to where we claimed a deferral benefit for a specific project. So we have 2 projects that had deferral benefits, 2 that didn't in the case of PHI, for example. So the 2 that had the deferral benefit, we'd be offering that additional commentary, brief commentary each year related to those 2 projects, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, each of the battery applications that were submitted had, you know, similarly a brief narrative, and here's what we anticipate we'll be able to accomplish in terms of a deferral with this investment. And so again, thank you. I think your interpretation is exactly what would meet our needs, and just kind of an annual update on reflecting on that initial concept and how it's evolving over time on the feeder on the network.
All right, so that would be kind of a text comment. Okay. All right.
Is it Dan Herson at BGE, or does this have to be a filing, or could this be an update to the work group or something that could be incorporated into another reporting obligation? I'm always reluctant to add to the list of.
Yeah, I don't know why it wouldn't become part of the reporting that's already being done.
Yeah, it would just be part of the annual report, right, Steve? Yeah.
That's what I was anticipating.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, not an additional report, right?
No.
Right. Good
Okay.
clarification, Dan. We don't want that. Yep.
Then there were a number of comments by the utilities kind of on the, I guess, organization. And I'm just going to speak to that briefly. I don't want to offend anyone, but in the interest of time, we're probably not going to make wholesale changes. And I actually kind of like that, you know, I think the working group was directed to talk about revisions and changes, and we're doing that in the narrative. So we're really only highlighting what's changed. But then also to address OPC's comment that, hey, we're really moving into the reporting phase. I sort of arranged the spreadsheet, you know, by the statutory reference for sort of ease of reference to those provisions. And I think it works. I don't think that we need to redo the narrative to match the spreadsheet. I'm pretty comfortable with how it is. So I'm going to ignore that comment, Steve.
Yeah, the only thing I would point out is that when we go through into the reporting cycle, that this will be kind of the template that we'll be constantly referencing. So I was just thinking of an ease of way of referencing that. That was my only point. You know, so we'll be going back and forth when we're doing that reporting. Have the utilities complied? You know, we'll be referencing this document presumably over time, right?
The attachment A.
Yeah, and the Word document, right?
No pressure, right, Steve?
Well, I just right. So the more methodical, the easier to track. It's just easier. That's all.
Okay. Yeah, I guess similarly, you didn't really like how it was arranged. Something about clustering the value streams methodology by topic rather than by category. Again, the narrative followed what we did before to the extent possible, just because if the commission looks back at what was filed before and is trying to align what's changed, it's just easiest that way. So unless there's a strong feeling there.
Yeah, I think you guys are the author of the report. So however you think best. I was just thinking about going forward, you know, when we're in this reporting cycle, this will just be such a critical document to refer back to. I was just looking for an easy way to make sure that everyone could go back and forth.
I guess it's
between the
always
two.
possible the commission will direct the working group to put together such a document, right?
Yeah, maybe. Right.
I mean, staff might even suggest that.
Yeah, well, maybe. Yeah, so I was thinking that what the Excel spreadsheet, the beauty of the way the Excel spreadsheet is laid out, this will become the template for how we report out. So we'll step through each of these items, make sure that we're actually reporting them out correctly, and then the cross-reference to the Word document, you know, just to make sure that it's aligned. That's how I think of it.
Okay, speaking of that, if we go to the spreadsheet, you have highlighted item number 10, total cost of permitting. Is there a reason?
Let me look at that.
And then similarly, was my understanding that.
Oh, yeah. So there are a couple of clarities on that. So we will have data related to the time of permitting, but the total cost of project permitting, how are we defining that? Are we just defining that as permitting fees? Or, because you can imagine, if one of these permits gets jammed up for some reason, they'll rely on, the vendors will rely on outside counsel or whatever. So I just want to make sure that we're narrowing this to be basically the permitting fees, because that's what's going to be what we can track, right?
Steve, this is Nitan. I mean, I think we've got the idea here is to capture soft costs, right? And the notion is that we'll be learning a lot about permitting for storage in Maryland as a result of it. So I think the permitting fee in and of itself does not actually capture the soft costs associated with bringing a project from soup to nuts and going through the permitting process. And particularly in Maryland, I'd be concerned about just doing the fee because, as we all know from the solar experience, it's difficult to permit at times. So I think we can be. I think I'm completely open to being more specific. In making sure that it's something that you can actually quantify, but I don't want to be so narrowly focused as to just talk about permitting fees.
Yeah, I would agree.
It's going to be difficult to estimate this cost, right? Because what do you include? What do you exclude? So we'll have a vendor, let's say, working in Ocean City, right? They're charged with the permitting, but our utility team will also assist with the project. Where do you draw the line? Or how do we report that out? I was concerned about that because I wasn't clear on how we would report that. Somebody comes back and says, hey, you didn't report it properly. The lack of clarity there will cause some reporting challenges, right?
Well, I think that you should try to report everything you can. The fact that some of it will have to be estimated doesn't mean you don't report it and just go back to just the fees, because that doesn't really tell us anything. So I think you're going to have to estimate it the best you can.
I think Steve, if you're looking for more specificity, I think that we can go there. We could say something, from my perspective, permitting timelines, like from the first pre-application meeting to the moment you get your permit, like that's indicative, right?
So
number of hours, yeah.
Yeah,
Doesn't have
you
to
have
be
the
dollar
number.
amount.
Yeah, you have the number of days, but then when you get down to number 10 on this list, it says the total cost of permitting. And it's just the absence of the definition where there's not clarity on actually how you report that out. Then it becomes kind of an estimated cost. And so that makes it challenging. Yeah.
Is it possible, would this help with, I don't know if this makes you feel any better, but is it possible to break it between here's the cost of permitting that counts against what I'll call the cost effectiveness of the project? So costs that you, the utility, actually incurred dealing with permitting, whether it be through you or your vendors, but you end up having to attribute that to the project because you had to bear the brunt of the cost. And then there is the more theoretical, well, I'll call it more estimated side, where the vendor, you had contracts in place where it's just like, we the utility don't have to eat the cost, but they have to deal with it. But we want to be able to report to Maryland what the cost of permitting looks like, but we won't be counting those costs against your project because you avoided those costs basically by having a contract in place.
Yeah. So my thought is you don't count any of these costs really against the project. What you're trying to do is get to the essence of what is the permitting process like? How long does it take? What were the approximate costs that were incurred? Because remember, we're going to have existing utility staff that won't be incremental. That'll basically dedicate some portion of their time to assisting the vendor get the permitting for a particular project if needed. And otherwise, the vendor has that responsibility. That's all baked into the costs that are already laid out in the contracts, right? Because they included that cost. We just won't be able to separately delineate it. So this would be an estimated cost, but it really doesn't impact the total project cost because it's already included in the contract fees. and then the incremental cost. So I'm just kind of a little bit puzzled on exactly how to report that. If we called that an estimated cost, at least, and somewhere we provide a definition of what's included in that estimate, that might be helpful, but otherwise it's a little amorphous for me. You
I
see
think
what I'm saying?
Nitsan, Nitsan, you offered to provide some specificity. Maybe she's not still.
Yeah,
Oh.
yeah, no, sorry. I definitely don't think that this should be counted against the utilities cost in the cost benefit analysis, because we're at the tip of the spear on permitting batteries in Maryland, and it's going to be expensive at the beginning from a permitting perspective, and then it'll go down over time. But I think the legislature would want to see what the current estimate is, and it doesn't have to. I think we're harking on costs here, but I think it's just more. Are there any, like, even if Steve, you want to just do the permitting costs, I do think that we should push ourselves to think about number of lawyer hours if you can't quantify the lawyer fees, number of, political outreach hours, just anything that provides a qualitative
or at least
layer.
At least a qualitative discussion, correct, of all the items that went into it.
Yeah, even if we just delineate the number of meetings or not. I don't know.
All right.
I'm just saying.
Not just the items, not number of, but the items that went into permitting.
Yeah. Would it make sense, Nitsan, if you and we, and I guess in the interest of time, we just kind of took that discussion and see if we can provide some clarity around it? Because I just worry that each of us are going to be thinking of this differently, right? And it's going to be a stack up of a bunch of different things, and we had to if we can define it more narrowly, then we're going to give you guys what you want. But if we don't, it's not clear to me what's being included in the figure. That's the issue. Yeah.
Let's chat this afternoon, Steve.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. The next thing I had was that the utilities didn't like the EV section. If that's the case, Steve, someone needs to propose language for the working group to consider for the EV section.
Yeah, if you recall the EV discussion about this is related to the electric bus depot, right?
Yes,
so we had our engineering guys reach back out to Montgomery County government and Alpha Structure, and we had suggested we would report out the number of electric transit buses each year at that location. You wanted some additional granularity of data. Montgomery County government and Alpha Structure has indicated that they could provide some additional data, but exactly the specifics of that we don't have yet. And so all I was going to suggest for that is we would be able to report out additional data, but we don't know exactly what pieces of data yet.
Okay, well, again, can you suggest language to that effect?
I can.
Okay. And then the next comment I had was something about hosting capacity. Why not provide hosting capacity maps?
Yeah,
I think staff wanted it in. Anyway.
So we agree that hosting capacity is difficult to delineate what the impact is, but we can, what we had offered as utilities is we do hosting capacity maps. We'll have those in place certainly in 2023. So our thinking on both the BGE and the PHI side was we would provide the hosting capacity maps related to that battery project, and you could see changes over time. The difficulty is assigning any of those hosting capacity map changes to the presence of a battery. That's the challenge, right? So we can provide that data, or we could punt that down the road, right? Because there's not a clear way that we would be able to demonstrate the effect of the batteries other than the aggregate hosting capacity maps. And we know, there's other things going on in there. There's new transformers in other places, and there's new DERs coming in and that kind of thing.
I thought we were going at it by way of the maps. I'm not sure what happened or what the comment really was about. Ben, are you still on, or did you leave?
No, I'm still here. Where are we looking? I'm sorry. Are we looking at our comments on page 14?
Well, I sort of summarized your comments for mine.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I just want to make sure I was like, I wasn't sure if I made the comment in the report or the Excel sheet.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know either.
Anyways, yeah, so I think the way I read the section in D was it's like we're dropping these, and I was like, I don't think we're looking to drop them as much as where we're at right now with the statements on page 14, as we weren't able to come up with a quantification for these.
Okay.
I think that was my that was the impetus to because when we discussed this, I do remember what Steve is saying, which is basically, and I don't disagree, I don't have a good way today of saying how the energy storage is going to improve the hosting capacity. Theoretically, it should do something for the hosting capacity. But we don't have a way to quantify that today. And so but we could have the maps to see that. And that's where I thought we were going. So when I read the language at the bottom of page 14 in our comments, it looked like we were removing this information. I don't think we should be removing it. I think we just need to be stating we can't quantify the impacts of it. Is where I was.
Yeah, and we agree with that, right? So we'd be sharing the hosting capacity maps as it relates to each of these projects annually, right?
Okay. I think we're good on that, right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to speed up. I know you guys have something at 10. I agreed with the utilities comment that it's not that the land use value doesn't exist or that we didn't have consensus. It's that the data wasn't really available or readily available. The utilities didn't like the economic development section, but it was in the original. So we'll edit it a bit, but I'm not sure why you didn't like it. There's a lot of things we didn't get to, such as resiliency, a whole bunch of staff comments on the spreadsheet that we didn't get to. How do people want to address the rest of the remaining items?
Yeah, so are we going until 10:30? Sorry, or are we?
Oh, some people have to drop off at 10. Who's dropping off at 10?
I do, Your Honor.
Okay, so we're losing Ben. Is that you okay, Ben, if we keep going without you though, right? I will post
I
this
think
recording.
You're running the issue of staff's comments because I wrote most of them.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. That's all right. I'm going to post the recording of this to YouTube, so as long as we can get our site up and running.
If you guys keep going, let me check in with John because I don't think we present till the afternoon, so I could probably not be on that call for the beginning of the hearing.
Okay.
So just give me a minute to check.
Okay, and we'll keep going here best we can. Utilities. I know. Utilities, back to the costs. It was my understanding that we broke down those costs based on the type of business model at your request. And now your comment is don't do that.
No. So just for clarity on that, can you hear me? Yeah, sorry. Is the idea is the Excel spreadsheet makes it look more complicated, right, in terms of reporting. So we'll be reporting out the similar cost data, capital and O&M data for each of the projects. The only comment is, do we want to list each of those individually? Because each project will get a report out on cost data. And so just the idea of simplifying the spreadsheet, but in terms of that layout. But if you want to list it separately, that's fine too. It's not a big deal.
I didn't, but I lost the battle. So then it got separated, and then now your comment is it doesn't need to be. So we'll think about it.
Yeah, it just looks more complicated as a result. If you want to leave it that way, we're okay.
Okay. Anything else on the spreadsheet on your end? I don't think so.
Yeah, and so just a quick question on this. And there is, I'm just taking a look at it. So the frequency on the reporting, just to comment on that, annually on or before July 1st. So can you talk a little bit about the timing of when that report would be submitted in your vision on that?
Well, I'm taking that from the statute.
Right.
So I'm not really sure your question. It comes straight out of.
Yeah. So so we're just looking at the cut date for that, right? So if you think about the PJM delivery year, for example, that ends May 31 each year. So are we thinking that that report is cut effective of what date in the year? So it's really the cut date for the report that would be going in for that July 1st reporting.
Well, and it does say you have to consult with MEA and OPC on it. So certainly there's a period of time before July 1 you'll be working on it with them. Correct?
Yeah. So, but if we just have a sense for what that cut time period is, so.
Does OPC have a position on that? They might have left. Steve, you're still there.
Yeah.
I don't know if. No, the other Steve. Sorry, Steve Latendra. Any thought on the timing, or is that not really what? I don't think that's something you were focused on.
No. I mean, that would, that would be interpretation of the statute, and I would defer to Mr. Cleaver on that.
Are you,
Okay.
is that sufficient time for the utilities? I mean, I think that leaves you a month, right? Is that why you're raising the issue, Steve?
Well, there are two issues. We just need to know generally what the cut date on the report is going to be, right? And then we need to know how much time we're going to have to compile it. And one of the things that we would point out is that the PJM delivery year ends May 31, but there's like a 60-day period where data is trued up and corrected, so it comes in later in time by at least 60 days, right, for the final data sets. So, you know, are we thinking that the report out is submitted to the commission, you know, like June 30th? Or are we thinking that that on or before July 1st means the report's filed like September 1st or something like that?
Oh, I would go with the former.
Okay, so we're thinking June 30th, then we would recommend probably a cut date of May 31 to time with the PJM delivery year. But the thing that we would point out is because of the timing, if we make this June 30th, the final market revenue related data may not be the final data for that delivery year as of May 31, right?
Yeah, I don't think you're going to get around that. You wouldn't get around it if you moved it back anyway.
Well, if for example we cut it May 31, and if the report were submitted on September 1st, then that would allow that market data to clear through. If we submit it on, you know, as of effective May 31, then it's the data that we know as of May 31. And then you know, we'd have, you know, potentially there could be an adjustment to the PJM market revenue, I guess, the following year. We'd have to think about how we'd report that out, right?
When do you get your revenue reports from PJM? Is it
So,
later?
yeah, they come in later in time. So what there is there's an initial market stream, and then later in time, PJM allows itself for like a 60-day settlement adjustment. And so they come in, you know, so that would be June 30th, July. So that would be, you know, that would be by like the end of July, right? So
But you'd have the preliminary data on revenue for energy frequency.
Yeah, we would, but we wouldn't have the final for
Understood.
that last
But by the
month.
time, but if you wait to use the final, then when you report, your data is going to be old, right?
Well, it's going to be accurate, right? So I don't know whether it's old, but it's accurate, right? So there can be adjustments in the settlements. So we could note that in the report, but you guys would have to recognize that there would be some noise depending on the delivery year, where that there would be some noise around revenue. You know, it's not likely to be a lot of noise, but there would be some noise, right?
Steve,
change, you can do an addendum.
Yeah, that's well, right. So those addendums are a lot of work for each.
Yeah,
of the
and I don't
utilities,
see
yeah.
that in the statute.
Yeah.
I know. I mean, we've got to meet this reporting the deadline. That's not really an option, I don't think.
Yeah.
I guess this has been with staff, so I'm able to hang on for a little longer. Because I did have a question about this because I wanted to make, I guess, didn't realize it was wanted to make Steve's life harder. So it was because staff has to submit, or well, the commission will have to submit 2 reports before July 1st, one in 2024 and one in 2026, to the legislature about these projects. And so if we weren't getting data until around that time frame every year, that seems that we would be submitting a report with the data that's about a year out of date. So I was wondering if we could, and I wanted to have this conversation with the utilities, is when did it make financially most sense with your books and everything for you to be making these reports? Because I would like to be able to get that. I think it would make sense for us to be able to get your information before July 1st each year so that we can do these reports to the legislature with data that is more than it, because arguably the 2024 report would basically, if we were to follow the current schedule, only have 2023 data in it. And so yeah. I wanted to figure out, is there a way that we can do the reporting so it's coming in much earlier than that, but it's not imposing a unreasonable burden on your systems to pull the data, and it is, reflective of reality.
Right. So we can cut earlier dates. We just have to be in agreement on what date you want to cut. recognizing that if you cut a date earlier than May 31st related to report outs, that you won't be capturing a PJM delivery year of revenue. And that's okay if you guys are okay with that, that's okay. So we could cut it, earlier in time at an earlier date in the month. We just need to know what that cut date is, right? And so ideally, in my view, if we would tell the commission what our intent is in terms of timing here, we're going to have to know that, in terms of when you cut that. So are you planning on, when we report out to the commission, are you then planning on taking that report and then packaging it into a different report for the legislature? Or are you planning on just providing that report directly to the legislature as well?
I'm not, I honestly don't know at this point.
Yeah,
The
okay.
commission shall submit a report to the General Assembly, so at minimum, we'll have to do some sort of aggregation. I imagine what will happen is you'll submit your report and your data, and I'm probably staff will then have to take that information and turn it into a summary report and I guess provide our assessment. But I think that is, at least that's how I envision it going. I mean, this could go many different ways that, and we won't probably know until we get more into 2020, get closer to those dates. But that's my initial reaction is you'll all submit your individual reports and then we'll take that and use that to write our report.
Right. So then we could agree, we just need to agree on what date that is, right? What the cut date is, and then how many days after that cut date we have to prepare the final report that we provide to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So-
And when you say PJM's, I understand PJM's delivery year.
Yeah, PJM delivery year runs June 1 to May 31. And so it's okay if you're willing to be out of cycle, and yeah, David Bloom, feel free to jump in too. But so the idea, it's okay to be out of cycle, but you would want to recognize that you're just reflecting the PJM revenue as of a certain month date, right? So
Okay,
and
so I guess that's what I was trying to get to, because originally you were saying we might have to be doing estimates, but I guess my question was as well, I thought you were getting monthly invoices from PJM, and so if that was the case, wouldn't we be, and basically we just say at this date, here's the actual data we have, and based off that data, here's what we can report to you.
Yeah, David Bloom, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Good morning, everyone. This is David Bloom with BGE, and just I guess to help this conversation along, the fifth business day of each month, we get PJM has the final, what they call final settlement data from 60 days prior, and so my preference would be that we use, for whatever we're going to be reporting, whatever the term period is, that we use the final data to avoid. While Steve characterized it as noise, I agree. The idea here is that it's noise, but you just never know. So I think we would want to rely on that final data that's available the fifth business day of each month for 60 days prior. So I think I have the math right here. Hypothetically, on the fifth business day of June, we'd have the April data as final.
But that would be too late for putting together a report that
Yes.
staff can then review. So we got to back it up.
Yes.
What about March 5th? What if you took the March 5th finalized data, which would be back to January, right? So you'd
Yes.
you'd have 6 months of actual finalized data at that point.
Am
I doing that right? September, October, November, December, January. No, 5.
So April. So on this coming April 7th, we will have final January data. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here. I need a.
Oh, you said 60 days. That sounds like 90.
Well, it's the month of January. January final to the month of January's final.
So the
data.
best we're going to get is 5 months of final data. That's the best we're going to do. I was trying to get to 6, but I don't think we can get to 6 because that pushes it too far for staff.
And ideally, all of the cut dates would be identical for each of the things we're reporting out, right? So that everything's consistent. So whatever cut date you want to make that, right, and the timing of the report, we just, do we want to tell the commission now? We probably a good idea, right? If we want to recommend something to the commission at this point in time.
Okay, and I'm not telling you what you have to do, but it's sounding like the cut date of March 5th for the data, 30 days for your report to staff, which gives them 30 days at least.
So then we would be cutting all of the data as of January 31. Is that right? And David, does that sound right to you?
No, the March, I have the calendar math right here, and I can make sure I have this crisp, is that if you were to do the 5th business day of March, you'd have basically you'd have December data as final.
All right, so why don't we suggest that we would cut the reporting period would be cut as of December 31, and that report would then be due in you know, I guess we'd have the data on March 5th for that period, David, and then so we would report out to the commission. How soon after that could we issue the report to the commission?
I mean, could we just say the April 1st?
April Fool's Day? Okay.
I think that works.
Okay. Why? I mean, David, if you think that works, I mean, right, you're closest to that timing on the reporting on PJM. So April 1st that we would target.
And then you would have a full 3 months to
deal with the other data sets, right? Yeah.
Well, and to talk to staff and OPC and MEA about the report before the final.
Oh, yeah, that's true. That's true as well. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we want to make it April 1st. Does that give you enough time for whatever you have to submit to the legislature?
Dan, if you had, I think we should, but Dan, I mean, will that be enough time for us? I think it should. It's 3 months, but.
Yeah, 3 months should be plenty of time.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So then would we say April 1st or would we say?
For the report to staff. That's more of an internal, right? Or are you saying you'd make a filing with the commission?
So the report, does the report go to staff and the commission, right? How does that process work here? Or is this just a report the utilities give to staff and then you do as you will with it for the rest, right?
So yeah, we'll have to create our own from what you file and from asking you questions. I think according to the statute, you're going to submit to the commission, MEA, and OPC the information or data concerning. So I think that's just probably an informational filing with the commission if everyone thinks that satisfies that requirement, maybe.
Yeah. So that becomes a filing with the commission, right? Annually as of April 1 currently, right?
April 1 is definitely before July 1. Is that what you?
Yeah, right, yeah. Right. And then you have the time for the packaging of whatever you're going to submit to the legislature.
Yes,
I think that
should have yeah, plenty of time.
Yeah, and we we'll want to socialize just internally with our teams that April 1 is okay internally with other schedules. So
okay, that's going to be the suggestion of the working group in the meantime, and then we can adjust as necessary.
Yeah. Right. That's right. And just the other question I had for you on this. So your vision of how we're going to lay out this template is it'll include all of the columns that you've included here in the draft document.
You're talking about the spreadsheet attachment A?
Yes. Yeah.
Unless you're suggesting that some of them disappear. Staff had comments. I don't know if they were really additions to the spreadsheet or really, more comments on them that we didn't get to.
Okay. Do you want to do that now? Or do you want to, I have a couple other items for you.
I have about 4 more minutes and then I'm going to have to hop off. You guys can stay on, but I have an appointment. So,
okay.
Ben, did you want to talk about some of your issues?
Yeah, so I guess on the very first one where it was talking about frequency, where it says annually on or before July 1st, I guess what we just had that discussion, so we can basically just say it's going to be made. And I would like that, I guess, to go through 2026 since we have to submit a 2026 report. So I think that's So basically, we'll just get this information through 2026 so we can submit the reports we need to submit.
And just for clarity on that, no reporting in 2022. It only begins in 2023, right?
Yeah, I think that'd be okay. Well, based off of what we just discussed, you would have no data to give us anyways.
Well, yeah, I mean, so yeah, depending, you're right.
Yeah.
So I think that makes sense. So 2023 becomes the first report.
Yeah, and then that should give us about a year and a half worth of data to start sifting through. Let's see. Oh, there was a comment on row 6. This had to do storage system cost actual. There was something in there about rate class impacts. And so I just wanted to get clarification. Are we looking, and this is for the final project cost of the virtual power plant model. I guess I wasn't sure if we're talking about increment, if we're talking about project costs or if we're talking about rate class impacts or both, but it seemed that the comment under granularity was saying both. So I just wanted to know what we were doing.
So for clarity, we won't know what the rate class impact is because we don't know yet how the commission will allocate costs across classes. We'll know what the costs are for the project, right? But we won't know how the commission is going to allocate it across rate classes. So, how do you think of that?
Right. I think that's fine. I mean, I would, since this is, we don't know how cost recovery is going to go yet. So I think it makes sense to say that this is the total cost. And if I guess you aren't planning on having customers pay anything, so there won't be any offset customer costs associated with that, correct?
Yeah, well, it depends on the timing of the recovery, right? So, so it's an unknown, right? And then the commission can allocate costs across classes as it deems appropriate. So, we really can't report on what the actual impact is until the commission makes the determination about the allocation.
Right. I agree with that. I think I was just confused because I think I wasn't even thinking that rate class impact should be included with that at this time. So
so I agree that we shouldn't include rate class impacts because we just don't have a basis for that calculation. Yeah.
I think that might be a holdover from the original filing.
It might be.
Okay. You had identify any issues with interconnection process. I think that's pretty self-explanatory.
Yep.
And apparently I was wrong on some of the things will change after the first report. As long as the utility agrees, we'll make those changes.
That's on 15. That's 15 and 16. So Steve, I know I think what I was going for, I know is that a number of the utilities, you have contracts in place, which is guaranteeing you capacity and energy. But since we're trying to, I'll say, learn from the pilot, we know there's a degradation factor associated with these storage units. So I was thinking we would have both we're guaranteed to have this, but also you would be stating, here's what this unit can actually do. And I'm assuming what the unit can actually do will still be above your guaranteed contract. But I think from a learning perspective.
Yeah, the only thing I'm not certain on, and maybe somebody else on the call is exactly how that would be measured for a particular project. So we'd have to look into how that is actually measured.
Right. I don't personally know. I know that typically your storage loses its value based off the number of cycles it goes through, but I don't know how you count that against your storage unit, like from a mathematical perspective.
Right, and I'm not sure exactly how that's measured, right? So that's going to be a reflection of how much energy you take out, how low you take it out on the discharge, the frequency of charging and all the rest. So we'll have to dig into, if we want to report anything out there, we'll have to dig into exactly how that calculation would work.
Yeah, if you're able to look at it and just let us, I think it would be useful for people since we're doing a pilot and we're paying for it. It would be nice. I think that's because people do that kind of stuff a lot, but maybe, I don't know if that's somebody in-house can do that or not. So
that may be something the vendors can provide. I just don't know how the calculation gets run. That's all.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess what I need for Steve, your group, to do is look at Ben's changes to the spreadsheet, answer questions where you can, and let me know where if there's anywhere you disagree with the changes or the language, you need to let me know. The
Okay.
last item I wanted to touch on before I have to jump off is OPC had a comment that for future energy storage project applications, they recommended that the utilities conduct a sensitivity analysis of wholesale market prices that are used to develop the projected revenues from PJM wholesale market activities. I think this is a good idea, but I think it's out of scope for our current reporting and our current, submission. That was my last thought that I think we have time for. We're going to do the best we can to capture today's discussion and everybody's changes in one clean narrative for recirculation. Similarly, we'll try to do that with the spreadsheet, but please send me comments to the extent that the language that's been suggested is somehow not what you agree to.
Okay. And just one other comment. There were a couple places where we said things were non-consensus, but really wasn't sure that really was the case where those items were flagged. So you might want to look
We
at
will
that
take
language.
that out.
Yeah.
We try to use that as little as possible, but also you have to understand when sending around a draft, we don't want to say everybody's agreed to everything, because that might offend people.
Sure. Makes sense. And then, I have a few people can stay on afterwards. I wanted to discuss a couple other items. Judge Lawrence, we probably don't.
I'm gone,
you
but
for that.
I'll leave this open and you're welcome to. Yeah, and there, of course, I think Dave Littell especially has another way to set up a meeting if you need to use a different platform.
Okay. All right. Sounds
Thank
good.
you, everyone. I'm sorry, but yeah, that's it. I thought we were going to be done at 10, so.
Yeah, very good.
Take care.
Thank you. All right. Are others still on the line?
Yeah, we're still.
Yep.
Yeah. So one of the things when we got into when Ed and I got into, I don't know whether Ed's still on, but we got into discussions of the emissions related to projects. There are a couple projects that we have that have PV arrays providing potentially part of or all of the energy supply for that storage unit. So the perfect example is the electric bus depot. Right now, because the ITC tax credit requirements and the plans for that site, the battery at that site will be largely or almost entirely charged by the photovoltaic array at that site. And so when we think of emissions data for that site, it really doesn't go to the marginal or the average hourly emissions that we talked about earlier on the PJM system. It goes to zero emissions, right, related to that PV array. And I'm just kind of wondering how you're thinking we would report that out.
Are you going to be collecting data on solar generation at all?
I don't think so, but we could talk with Alpha Structure about what we might be able to offer there, because I don't know what kind of data sets that we'll have. They've indicated because of the ITC tax credit that battery at that location will be charged minimum 75% of the time from the PV array. Right. So, an assumption going in, because of the ITC tax requirements, we could make an assumption about that percentage and then assume the rest is the marginal or the whatever, the average or the marginal, depending on which we're using for each application for the rest of PJM. Or if we have more specific data, we could provide that. So, any thoughts on that one?
Steve, is it DC coupled system? What's the point of coupling?
I don't know, but I have to.
That makes a difference. Yeah.
I would suspect, Neetson, that it's probably DC, but I don't know how the microgrid is configured to that level. Yeah, but I would imagine it's likely DC, right, on that system.
Where you were, Neetson, is where you were going. That assumption is a lot, tighter to verify if it's a DC coupled system.
Yeah, well, I was trying to think of what the electrons are doing, whether the solar electrons would be going to the grid directly or can only go through the battery.
Well, they would, so it's a microgrid, right? So everything is behind the meter, right? So likely, and again, because we're not the operators of the microgrid or the configurators of the microgrid, it's likely that the PV array is connected directly in a DC manner to the battery system. Again, it's microgrid behind the meter. So there's some reasonable assumptions to make, right? But we may or may not have the exact figures depending on what we're able to get from alpha structure.
What type of reporting do you have for the ITC to claim that 75%?
I don't know the answer to.
I think it's probably an IRS audit because I've never heard of anyone reporting energy information to the IRS. Has anyone else on the call?
But yeah, but there is a storage ITC in play that could happen that would liberate everybody from these charging requirements. But
well, the beauty of, I mean, the way it's structurally built, right? The PV array is largely going to be charging the battery at this site. That's good news from an emissions standpoint, right?
Well, so Steve, that I think that's the point. Like, you know, this is a conversation that we always have around hybrid resources and emissions impact. Is that it really depends on what that unit could have done to the grid at the time where it was charging from the solar. That's why I was asking about DC coupled, because if the solar electron could be put out onto the grid at the point where the marginal unit is a high emitting unit, it may actually be better from an emission standpoint than charging the asset itself, the battery itself, right? But I think then
yeah, that is really complex. But yes, I hear you.
Okay,
Yes.
so but then that brings us back to what Ben said about an hour ago, which I think is completely legit, which is none of these assets are big enough to really change and alter behavior on the margin for the marginal peaking units, and so maybe we don't need to dive too.
I would recommend, just to reflect the full value, right, that what we do here is for the electric bus depot, when we get into that calculation, what we'll do is we may need to make an adjustment for where we know that there's PV arrays charging the battery. We'll want to adjust those figures to reflect that fact. That's all I'm saying. And specific, we'll work through the specific mechanics, but the more that we define things, the less then we're going to, you know, argue in the future that, you know, it's whether it's reported correctly.
I would recommend you put that in the emission methodology document, just lay it out. I will tell you, I don't conceptually have a problem with it, but I think the question will be make sure staff and OPC are okay with it. But I think it's a legitimate, you know, assumption. It's a rough assumption, but if you want to use 75% at least for that one,
it's a pretty good approximation of what reality will be, right?
Yeah, and I am glad. I know this detail is a pain for everyone, but I'm glad we're getting into it now because it's better than you getting into it, you know, when you're figuring out how to report and then and having others say that's not how you're supposed to measure it. You know, we're going to avoid that problem.
Right. So if you think about how this reporting mechanics work, we'll be working through the data sets probably on a monthly basis, right? So that we can build to the annual report. So, you know, better that we kind of clarify anything up front.
Steve.
Yeah.
How much, I guess, to me, yeah, because I think that this is an extremely useful thing to look at, and I don't think we should be counting. Again, if you're able to charge your storage using that solar unit, I don't think we should be counting that against you. I guess I guess my question to you is, and it sounds like you're still figuring this out, is what visibility do you have into the electrons flowing on that microgrid and figuring out, I guess, I just don't know the configuration in terms of, does everything need to go through a single point that is metered by your storage? Like, I guess it's just kind of like, can you figure, are you going to have the ability to see what electrons came into your storage unit from the microgrid side versus what came in through the grid? And maybe that's not possible. But
yeah, that's really a follow-up discussion with alpha structure, because we don't know, you know, what kind of viewpoint we're going to have into that. We'll certainly know what they're required to do from a tax standpoint, but again, in terms of that electron flow, we'll have to see with alpha structure how much of that data we can get. The more we get, the better, right? But I don't know how much we're going to be able to see out of it.
And probably what would be good to find out from them at minimum is, to me, the coupling, I wasn't even thinking about, because the coupling, I think, will have a big impact in terms of your round trip efficiency losses in terms of pulling the solar energy into your system versus spitting it back onto the grid.
Right. Yeah. So in the microgrid, right, it's not going to get spit back into the grid. It's all going to be used on site. So it won't do that. But to Neatson's point, you know, if you think about it, really, it's offsetting what otherwise would have been consumed from the grid. So it really doesn't matter whether it's used on site or whether it's exported to the grid, right? It doesn't make any.
It's better because you don't have all the losses from the grid.
Agreed. It is even better because of the absence of the line losses. Yep, you're right about that.
And OPC in our prior comments were very supportive of co-locating storage with solar, and specifically because of that benefit of having that zero emission resource supporting a storage asset.
Right. So that leads to your comment there leads to another question that said technology that's coupled with the storage, and can we get some clarity on what we're intending there? So our thinking is technology that's coupled with the storage really is whether there's PV arrays or the gas generator at the microgrid coupled to it. Did you guys have a view on that?
Wait, say that again, Steve. I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's and I'm just looking for the language in here. Oh yeah, it says on line 17 on the spreadsheet, it says type of energy. Well, there's a type of energy storage technology, but then there's another place which it says technology that's connected to the storage. I'm just trying to find the point. And by that language, you know, our interpretation of that is it's things like the PV array that's coupled, really. That's the heart of it.
Yeah.
The line 25 versus line 17, Steve, is that where you're going?
Yeah, there you go, 25.
This
Yep.
is for under project details, right, Steve? This is just to give additional insights into the configuration of the asset.
Right, and Neatson, what technology? I mean, all we think of is the PV array.
Well,
Are you thinking of something else?
Well, I mean, let's talk about it. I think it was intended to be, is it hybrid, is it standalone? But then for the microgrid, whatever, I mean, I can't remember off the top. You said there's this, is it CHP or I don't remember.
Yeah, there's a gas generator at the site
then
too.
definitely add that.
So it'd be the gas generator and the PV array would be.
It could be other options too. It could be hydroelectric. It could be gravity. There are other options, maybe not so much in Maryland, but there are other options where you're going to have energy that's produced that can't be used at the time, such as, you know, wind or other options that can't be used that are going to be stored. And so that needs, maybe we're setting up for a larger platform, like including Colorado, because Washington State has lots of hydroelectric. So that might be why the vocabulary is in there.
Okay. And so for this purpose, though, what we're saying is the PV array and the gas generator would be examples of technology pairing, right? At the microgrid. So that really is
probably also the EV chargers. Yeah, Steve, I would probably also throw the EV charger into that as well.
As part of the technology.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So should we spell that out a little bit anywhere? Because if we could at least in the comments, because I don't, you know, a year from now or when, you know, whenever we get back into this, we probably want to just clarify what we mean, and that way the commission will know too.
I feel like this has been in there for ages, but I'm fine being more specific if you want, Steve. Whatever. I know you love specificity. I'll do it.
Right, because it reduces any need for clarification in the future, and it reduces a debate related to how the metrics are reported. So the more specific
Steve,
we can be, the better.
Where does something like the library fall into all this? I know the library isn't really I know the library isn't technology, but the enabling of being able to island that library is, I don't like an add-on, I guess. Is that something that we would consider a technology here? I guess I'm just trying to make sure we understand the basis by which, how far we're going with this.
Okay, so I was thinking that islanding will capture that, right? To the extent that it's applicable. So I wasn't thinking of that, but if you want to include it, I'm okay with it.
Well, it was, once again, I also was trying to figure out, so I know I'm also later to the game than most others on this call with where we were going with all this a year or two ago. Just was the goal, it sounds like the goal was to figure out if there were things that were using or filling the storage we would want to report at this point, but I couldn't tell if we were also like, are there other additional technological add-ons to the storage unit that aren't just purely for storage purposes, and if that was also encompassed by this thought.
So the specific statutory language is that any technology with which the storage is paired. It was certainly intended to mean, solar, but to Kathleen's good point, if we want to set a foundation that can be replicated and expanded if there's ever a larger program in Maryland, I'm totally open to it. And I think if there are, from staff's perspective, learnings that you all want to gain from this that talk about, that go beyond the pair technology, I think as long as the utilities are happy with it, let's put it in there.
Yeah, let's just, all I'm looking for is specificity on what we intend to include, right?
Okay.
So that we develop the report and then we don't later in time argue, hey, that it should be something else. So if we could spell out what we mean by that, yeah.
The only thing I would recommend is maybe you talk when you're pairing whether something is a renewable source, a green source, or a fossil fuel source, like you're talking about the generator. And I think eventually the goal is, hopefully, that we'll be able to, provide energy to the batteries from all these renewable sources and not pull from the grid and then discharge to the grid. So maybe we should just segregate it, if you want to give some definition to it, as a renewable or a non-renewable source. Because the other thing is technology. Honestly, 3 years ago, we wouldn't have even been having this discussion. The technology is changing so fast that if you define what the technology is, what happens if a new technology shows up? Do we have to go back through and redefine and reestablish that is a valid technology?
Well, all I'm looking for is a little more specificity by what we mean by that. That's all.
That's a good clarification issue.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Steve, to go back to the emissions, to your photovoltaic question, am I safe to assume that there's a possibility the CHP plant could possibly charge that energy storage unit?
Yeah. When you see it, certainly possible, right? So
there's always waste energy somewhere.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm just trying to figure out. So once again, this is a detail we'll need to work out eventually. If we're going imagine that direction with photovoltaics, ignore the CHP.
Right. So imagine that multi. Let's say you have a storm come through, right? There's not going to be any PV production necessarily, like it's cloud cover, and then so the battery storage units are probably then getting charged somewhat by the gas generator at the site. Right. So that 75% ITC requirement when you think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be a little odd to run the CHP plant just to charge the storage, unless it was, I guess you were dealing with high prices from the grid. It just was.
Well, you could be an islanding event, right? Or you could be dealing with
that's not the design. That's kind of like, that happened.
Right, but Kathleen, our goal is to measure how this project works, and if that's what happens, that's what happens. I mean, storage is emissions agnostic. It's not a renewable resource. It is a resource that can enable renewables, and we want to see how that will work. But it's very possible that it gets paired with a gas generator, and then we need to know the outcome of that. It's not a bad thing. And I don't hold that against storage. It's just is something that could happen.
It's just reality, right? So all we're trying to do is report out reality of what happens, and that's all.
Yeah.
Okay.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
This is the energy storage pilot, not the renewable energy storage pilot.
Right. We're just trying to report out actually what takes place and give you guys a picture into what we're seeing from the battery systems.
If you happen to be,
what's
if
that?
you happen to be running cogen for thermal uses, that would be interesting, but let's not go there.
Yeah, right. Please don't go there. Okay, so I think that's it for now. We'll review Ben's comments, and then I'll try to gather our folks internally to take a close look at that, and then get back to you guys on exactly what we're seeing there.
Yeah, and Steve, if you need to talk about any of that, I'm available all day tomorrow. So if there's any questions your team has, I'm happy to talk through any of that.
Yeah, and I was generally comfortable with the emissions discussion and where we ended up. The only caution I would have is the more complex we make the reporting, the more challenging it becomes for everybody, right? To make sure that things are reported out in a appropriate manner. So, marginal versus average, I agree with Ed's positioning on it, but we just have to be certain that we're reporting out things in a way that everyone is in agreement on and are as simple as possible, right? As we look forward.
Can I,
yes.
I'm going to ask if anyone has anything else. But two, I agree with your point, Steve. Simplicity. The purpose of doing that methodologies document is to make sure we're all on the same page. And to that extent, if it is helpful, I will also make the same offer Ben did tomorrow to get on the phone. And if you, Ed, or David think that's sufficiently likely, we could pre-schedule a time just to go over any issues that you might identify. We're happy to do that. I have time tomorrow because we're really in a crunch. Judge Lawrence is going to be.
I think we should, David, that's a great point. I think we should schedule something now. Schedule something for tomorrow if you can.
Yeah, if you want to set up, what time did you have in mind? We just need sufficient time to regroup internally, right? And see if we can get everyone aligned along with 1,000 other meetings, right?
After 10 and before 2.
Well, let me just, I'm pretty jammed in the morning. So what about after 1 or after 5? 1 to,
fine.
1 to,
I can do 5 to 6.
1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 5 o'clock.
All those times work tomorrow.
What about?
Can we do 5? Or, I guess it doesn't matter. I can.
Or is this today?
So
tomorrow.
It's better to do like during the day. That way we can make sure we get some of the engineers if we need that. If you do after 5, you'd certainly get me, but I don't know how many other people we'll get. Right.
Okay. Why don't we do 1? I'll set up a. I know Marilyn likes to use Teams, so I'll set up a Teams meeting.
And you'll include Ben in that discussion?
Yeah, Ben,
okay.
Steve, Joe, Nitsan, who else wants to be involved?
I think you do. I mean, I can include people on the utility side, after this call, I can forward that.
I have the email, Steve, with other utility metrics in the discussion we have, so I can invite. I can use that list.
Okay. Hey, the only other question I want to ask you guys is that is Potomac Edison, did they get invited to all of these as well? I assume, right?
I haven't heard them on any call. Who's?
It's Brian Mollenshot. So maybe I'll reach out to Brian and just tell him.
Yeah, let's make sure Brian's okay with everything here.
yeah, right. So, I mean, it's the Exelon utilities that we didn't, First Energy may have a different view on something, right? So
Brian was on the call earlier. I don't know exactly when he dropped off, but I did see his name earlier on my screen. Today, yes.
Oh, okay, great. So he was on the call. So maybe I'll reach back to him independently just to make sure, right? So, because I don't want to speak on his behalf, right? Since we're the Exelon companies. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. One question I did have, Dave, that I think is really quick on row 33, cost recovery rate of return applied to the project. Are we talking about the ROR used for I guess cap like what they would use to, or what the utilities would use to earn a return, or is this the ROR used in the net present value calculation? And I ask because I think all the utilities except BGE use the same ROR, but BGE, I guess, use two different RORs. They use their return one and then they use an after-tax one. And so we probably need to make it clear what ROR we're discussing. And I think there.
Yeah, and the other thing, we won't know until we get the commission authorization on recovery, right? What the right number is. Yeah.
My reaction to that is that that metric is to measure costs to ratepayers. So I would think we would use the ROR that's actually being applied and approved by the commission for cost recovery.
Okay.
Well,
but is that before it's authorized though? So we would just use the current one, but we don't know what the commission will actually authorize until the recovery is authorized, right?
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, so you'd have to use your current.
I would just probably have a footnote, Steve, that states like when the report comes, it's just here's the ROR active at this time, but this is not the ROR that this is. We can only like basically something that says it's unknown until such time as the commission allows cost recovery.
Correct.
OPC on the same page on that one?
Sorry, Dave.
I just want to make sure that OPC is on the same page since cost issues usually pique their interest.
Unintended.
Okay.
Sorry, what was the question again?
Yeah, I got to jump, so but I'm good.
Okay. Can I just request on Judge Lawrence's behalf that you all update your prior comments, cleaning them up, indicating where issues have been addressed, or just eliminating them if we decided they could be eliminated, so she has revised versions of what you submitted.
Are you saying on the Word document and the Excel document, or just the Excel document?
Whatever you think needs to be revised. That just
okay.
Well, in particular, just to echo what David just said, in particular, if there's a lot of language that's just that was proposed as edits that's going to get dropped into the report. So speak now or forever hold your peace. So like we've flagged them during this call. Ben's 2 paragraphs on Empower, the quality, the power quality section. Just like make sure you're comfortable with everybody's edits.
Gotcha.
I just want to make sure she doesn't have 6 versions of documents that she needs to go through, that she has a revised version from each of you. So she only has 3 sets. That's enough to have to figure out.
And by she, you're referencing Judge Lawrence, right?
Yeah, I mean, she may delegate it to us and need some, but and we've been doing different parts, but she is running this, as we all know. She's the judge. So
yep, very good. Okay, we'll try to do that. Yep.
Thank you, everyone. We got through a lot. So
yeah, thanks. All right, thanks for the discussion.
Thanks, everyone.
Good day now.